Hello, fellow Planeswalkers. It's day 5 and 6 of Wilds of Eldraine spoiler seasons. We got some cards to talk about from over the weekend. But before we get started, special thanks to Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring this videos and our other Wilds of Eldraine spoiler videos. So let's get started with the new cards from Wilds of Eldraine. So the first card we got is Charming Scoundrel. For 1 and a red mana, you get a Human Rogue. That's a 1/1. It has haste. And when Charming Scoundrel enters the battlefield, choose one. You can draw and discard a card, you can create a treasure token, or create a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature you control. So most of the time, what we're probably going to see with this card is you're going to choose the Wicked Roll token, it becomes a 2/2, and when it dies, you get to do a damage to your opponent. So it's a little bit of extra value on this card. So I see this going into potentially the mono red deck, so I think right now it's probably the best card we've seen over the weekend. Next we've got Hilda's Crown of Winter. For 3 mana, you get a legendary artifact that you can pay 1 and tap target creatures. This ability costs 1 less to activate during your turn. And for 3, you can sacrifice Hilda's Crown of Winter, draw a card for each tapped creature your opponent controls. So I really like this card. We've been talking about cards that fit with Hilda, and this definitely does fit with Hilda, where you're going to be tapping down things every turn. Then you're going to get the advantages of Hilda, probably creating that 4/4. And I think they work in consort together very well. And we'll have to see if there's enough other stuff around that to make that a viable strategy in Standard. Definitely in Limited, very good, very good card. Next we have Tangled Colony. For 1 and a black mana, you get a rat. That's a 3/2. Tangled Colony cannot block, and when Tangled Colony dies, create X 1/1 black rat creature tokens where this creature cannot block, where X is the amount of damage dealt to it this turn. So the fact that you can't block with it kind of makes that ability a little bit less desirable, but as we've seen with a number of different cards in Standard over the years, just being able to attack with something and hopefully kill an opponent's creature and then get value in the form of 1/1 tokens, that is in and of itself enough to make this card playable in Standard. Next, we got another of our creature lands from the set, Restless Bivouac. It comes into play tapped, as all the other ones do. It creates red or white mana. For 1, a red and a white mana, Restless Bivouac becomes a 2/2 red and white ox creature until end of turn. It's still a land. And whenever Restless Bivouac attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So I think I really like this of all the creature lands. That ability to put a +1/+1 counter on another creature every time it attacks, I think is a really valuable ability in Standard. And you can always put it obviously on Restless Bivouac, but if you can put it on other things as well, because you know Restless Bivouac's not going to die that turn, then you can help build up your board state, protect your cards potentially a little bit. So I really like this land, and Boros could certainly use a good creature land to use. Next, we've got Archon of the Wild Rose. For 2 and 2 white mana, you get an Archon. That's a 4/4 with flying. And other creatures you control that are enchanted by auras you control have base power and toughness 4/4 and have flying. So this is probably the card that has the potential to have the biggest top end of all the cards we looked at today. Because if you're playing this in an auras deck, you get it down, all of your creatures become 4/4s, and then they have flying, and potentially you play this on that one turn, and you swing and you win the game on that turn. Obviously, we've got all the cards that are going to be creating rolls, so that's going to mean that a lot of cards are going to naturally have auras on them because of that. But also, there are actually a lot of decent 1 and 2 mana auras in Standard right now that we could certainly use in combination with Archon of the Wild Rose to create a big swing on one single turn. And I think that's probably the way that you would use this, is you play it and then you swing and hopefully you win the game right there. Otherwise, because of the aura requirement, unless we're seeing an auras deck, I don't think it works very well, because you're not likely to get the value of it, which is having all the creatures you control that have an aura attached to them, 4/4s, and giving them fly. Next, we got a Tale for the Ages. For a white and a colorless mana, you get an enchantment. Enchanted creatures you control get +2/+2. So this really goes with Arcana of the Wild Rose really well. So I think if there does become an enchanted deck, and again, the key here is it has to be enchanted, not enchantments, but enchanted decks, then I think this is a card that naturally just falls into that deck. So all your creatures that have enchantments attached to them, now they get +2/+2, and that's a really good value for only 2 mana. So in that enchanted deck, I think this is a really good card to have in there and would be an automatic 4 of. Next, we've got some other rares from the last couple of days. We've got Raging Battle Mouse for 1 and a red mana. You get a mouse that's a 2/1, and the second spell you cast each turn costs 1 less to cast, so a little bit of an advantage. It has Celebration. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So that same celebration ability that we've seen throughout is on this. So it potentially a 3/2 for 2. But again, you've got to meet that requirement of having 2 things enter the battlefield on a given turn. So while it's an interesting card, I don't think it's standard playable. Next, we have Rotisserie Elemental. For a red mana, you get a 1/1 with Menace. Whenever Rotisserie Elemental deals combat damage to a player, put a skewer counter on Rotisserie Elemental. Then you may sacrifice it. If you do, exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of skewer counters on Rotisserie Elemental. You may play those cards this turn. So I think, again, this is a card that kind of has a relatively low floor in it, because you're likely to be able to attack with it and get in at least one attack where you're going to be able to get your skewer counter, assuming you're getting this out on turn 1. So yeah, you're probably going to get 1 skewer counter. But the question is, to get 2 or 3 skewer counters on it to get the real bang for your buck, we're going to have to do one of 2 things. It's got to get bigger, or you've got to have something that's going to proliferate those skewer tokens that will increase the value of it. So I think we've got definitely some things that proliferate that could help this card, but probably it has to go in a very, very specific kind of deck for it to really matter. And because of that, probably not going to see much play in Standard. Next, we've got a couple of white cards. First, we have Charmed Clothier. For 4 and a white mana, you get a Fairy Advisor. That's a 3/3. It has fly, and when Charmed Clothier enters the battlefield, create a Royal Roll token attached to another target creature you control. So you can't attach it to yourself. It has to be to another one. But in Limited, I think this is a fine card, because you're basically getting 4 power and toughness for 5 mana, and it has flying. And in Limited, that's okay, because this could then be the thing that finishes off the game for you. Otherwise, not a standard playable card. Next, we have Eerie Interference for 2 and a white mana. Prevent all damage that would be dealt by creatures to you and creatures you control this turn. So this is, a fog effect, basically, where your creatures are going to be protected, and you're going to be protected for a turn. Now, is this standard playable? Probably not. In Limited, it's probably a pretty good card, because your opponent could swing in, you could block a lot of things, probably killing a few, and then prevent all the damage to you and your creatures. And as a result of that, you can swing on the next turn, hopefully win the game. So Limited, again, both these cards I think are fine and have playability. Next, we have Armory Mice. For 1 and a white mana, you get a 3/1 mouse, and it has, again, Celebration. So continue with our Celebration theme. Armory Mice has +0/+2 as long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn. So the same ability that we've seen. So you can make this a 3/3 for 2 mana, assuming you're bringing 2 permanents into play on the next turn or the turn after that. In Limited, probably an okay card, but probably not standard something we're going to ever see in Standard. Next, we've got some blue spells for the day. First, we've got Spell Casting Torrent for 3 and a blue mana. You get an Elemental Wizard. That's a 2/4. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a sorcerer role token attached to up to one other target creature you control. So this has some interesting application, I think. If you're in a deck that really wants to attach auras to things, then I think this might be a card that you would include for that purpose. Now, we already talked about Archon of the Wild Rose earlier. So if we're trying to make sure that all of our creatures have roles, then a creature like this makes a lot of sense. But again, the limitation is you've got to cast an instant or sorcery to get that sorcerer role token. So that kind of goes against the grain of what you're probably trying to do in the deck. But potentially it could meet that criteria, and you could really get the advantage from Archon of the Wild Rose with it. So potentially has some standard playability, but again, it's in a very, very specific deck. Next, we have Galvanic Giant for 3 and a white mana. You get a 3/3 Giant Wizard, and whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. On the surface, pretty good limited card. Again, having the requirement here of 5 mana to get the effect, probably not something we're going to see very much in Standard, but in Limited you might see it a little bit more often. And then its adventure is Storm Reading for 7 mana. You can draw 4 cards and then discard up to 2. So very much overcosted effect here, because we've already got a spell from this set that does exactly the same thing for 4 mana, and we've got Memory Deluge that does the same thing for 4 mana, and Storm Reading is basically playing Memory Deluge, but playing it for its activation from the graveyard. So probably not something we're going to see in Standard. Next, we've got Twisted Sewer Witch for 3 and 2 black mana. You get a 3/4 Human Warlock. And when Twisted Sewer Witch enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature cannot block. Then, for each rat you control, create a Wicked Roll token attached to that rat. So basically, when you cast this, you're going to guarantee yourself to have 1 rat, and then each of the rats that you have is going to become a 2/2. And that's a very powerful ability in a rats only deck. If we dedicated rat deck, this card would definitely, I think we would want to have in there, because it's going to pump up your whole team, and that's not something normally we'd be able to do to these kind of creature tokens. Next, we've got Ferocious Vermin for 2 and a black mana. You get a 2/1, and when Ferocious Vermin enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature cannot block. Whenever another creature you control dies, then put a +1/+1 counter on Ferocious Vermin. So this is again an effect we see sometimes where things dying pumps up a creature. It's a common here, so I don't think Wizards is seeing this as something that is really going to do incredibly well on its own. So I'm very hesitant to say this would fit into the rat deck. But the fact that rats dying does give it counters, and there's no limitation to those counters, I think might give it some standard playability. Next, we have Fairy Fencing for X and a black mana. Target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. It gets an additional -3/-3 if you control a fairy as you cast this spell. So in a Fairies Matters deck, this is a great card. So 1 mana, give something -3/-3. It kills a lot of things in Standard right now. If you don't have a fairy, then I think we've got better choices in Standard, honestly, than this to use as removal. But if we do have a dedicated fairy deck, then I think this has a place in it, because basically for a mana you're giving something -3/-3, and that a lot of times is going to be able to take out the bulk of the creatures your opponent has. Next, we've got a couple of red cards for the day. First, we've got Grand Ball Gas for 1 and a red mana. You get a Human Peasant. That's a 2/2. It's another celebration card, and Grand Ball Guest gets +1/+1 and has trample as long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn. So that same kind of ability that we've seen. And again, if we somehow, I think this is a good limited card, but beyond that, it probably has limited to no standard playability. Next, we have Harried Spearguard for 1. It's a human soldier with haste, and when Harried Spearguard dies, create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature cannot block. Probably not a standard playable card, but in limited, I think it's a pretty good card because for 1/1 that's haste, you're probably going to be able to get in a few attacks with it, and then when it dies, you get the advantage of getting a rat creature token when it does die. So limited, again, these I think are good cards for limited, but beyond that, probably not much else. Lastly today, we've got Belligerent of the Ball. For 2 and a red mana, you get an Org Warrior, that's a 3/3. Again, it has Celebration. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains menace until end of turn. So I think that's a nice ability because it's a combat specific ability, but again, it's requiring that you've got to have 2 permanents enter the battlefield every turn. You want to activate that ability. So it's an okay card, and certainly a very limited playable card as a 3/3 for 3. But I don't think we're going to get that Celebration ability to activate as much as we would like it to. And because of that, I think it's not really going to be something that makes it in the standard. All right, those are our cards for today. Hope you enjoyed a look at our spoilers. I think, Charming Scoundrel and Restless Bivouac were the best 2 cards we saw over the weekend. And I think those are going to definitely see a bunch of standard play come Wilds of Eldraine season. So thanks for staying to the end of the video. Remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this. And we'll be back tomorrow with more Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. I'll see you then.